Okay, here's another one. This one comes in from Rusty Walker. This was in a video I put on genetic entropy 2 weeks ago. So Rusty Walker says, genetic entropy ignores that the majority of those mutations are never passed on. Yeah, I typically point out the fact that we get a lot of mutations. Okay. Millions and millions and millions and millions of mutations. Thank God we have these extraordinary, these amazingly designed DNA repair enzymes to fix a lot of these DNA breaks. So you're going to have a lot of mutations in somatic cells, like your skin cells. They're not going to be passed on. But mutations in reproductive cells, they can be passed on. And again, yeah, not every single mutation that occurs is passed on. But the ones that are passed on. They're deleterious. Most of them are slightly deleterious and harmful. They're overwhelmingly harmful. Okay, man, most of them being low impact, sure. And the mutation rate's high. In mammals in general, the mutation rate's high. In humans, the mutation rate's about 100 new mutations per person per generation. Okay, well, selection's limited. Selection's very weak. Selection can only see the big mutations and can only remove the big mutations. Selection may be able to amplify the occasional, the rare beneficial mutation, but the conventional literature suggests that beneficial mutations, when they do happen, they happen infrequently, only about 1 in a million. And when they do, as we've discovered here, as we've discussed, they are typically reductive and functionally compromising to organisms. Now, we can discuss all day the possibility of some of these beneficial mutations not being reductive in any way. And we've done that. We can discuss nylon digestion by bacteria. We can discuss lactose tolerance. We can discuss a number of mutations, melano mutation. Okay. The point is to overcome the influx, the incredible influx of low impact, nearly neutral, slightly deleterious mutations. You're going to need hundreds to thousands of truly beneficial mutations to counterbalance the damage. Okay. And the proponent of common descent, especially when they do their mathematical modeling or make their arguments and points or create their stories, they're assuming that way too many of these beneficial mutations that happen are non-reductive. When again, most of them are reductive. They're due to the elimination of pre-existing genes, pre-existing systems. They're reductive. That's not going to help you climb Mount Improbable and take your fish to fisherman or your goo to you or your bacteria-like organism to biologist. You need truly beneficial mutations. Trade-offs aren't going to work. They're just going to result in shrinking functional genome sizes. So, okay, not every mutation is passed on, sure. But the mutation rate is high. Again, it's 100 new mutations per person per generation. Selection can't see most of those because selection can't see the slightly deleterious mutations. They're only seeing the big ones. It's only seeing, and natural selection, it's simply differential reproduction. Who's reproducing the most? Who's passing on their genes the most? Okay. So if a mutation happens that doesn't affect reproduction, then that individual, that mutant's not going to be removed from the equation. And so those mutations that are slightly deleterious, that evade selection, they are passed on to the next generation. They're subject to genetic drift. And so they drift throughout the population. And that population slowly descends into overall genetic degeneration. Let's continue here. He says, this evolutionist, it is based on something that is true. Yeah, the mutation rate's high, selection is weak, selection can't see most of these mutations, so they're passed on. They accumulate. And by the time they accumulate to where they're noticeable, that population has descended into degeneration. What's selection going to do? Remove the entire population from the equation? That's not evolution, but it's so badly misunderstood. And what I mean by that, let's say you take a room of 100 people. Everybody's multiply mutant. Okay, we've all accumulated mutations over time. Genetic entropy is the fact that every generation is just a little bit more mutant than the previous generation. I'm a little more mutant than my parents. My parents are a little bit more mutant than their grandparents. So it's that every generation, they've accumulated a little bit more mutations than the previous generation. So that means every single human being on the planet, 8 billion people, every person's mutant. Some may be a little more mutant than another. And everybody has a highly complex mix of traits and mutations. Okay. And so if you were to have a room full of 100 people, everybody is multiply mutant. So, okay, let's give the evolutionists the benefit of the doubt. Let's just be generous and say, okay, remove from that room your 50 worst mutants, the individuals that have the most mutants in that room. Okay. So you remove 50 people. There's 50 left. You removed 50% of the worst mutants. So what are you left with? Are you solving the problem? No, because now you're just left with 50 people that are more mutant than the generation before it. Remove 75%, 80%. The point is what you're left with every time is a generation that's more mutant than the previous generation. So nothing can really stop this genetic degeneration. Okay, so let's continue. So no, it's not misunderstood. Those that understand this problem, and another thing too, is the problem's even worse when you understand that the majority of the genome's active and functional, including these so-called evolutionary leftovers in DNA elements like pseudogenes, the loose sequences, these various classes of retrotransposons. So the more functional the genome is, the bigger of a problem we have here. The conclusion is irretrievable. The conclusion's obvious. It's very simple. It's very easy. It's very clear. And that's why the evolutionists have to dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge, unfortunately. And they got to run in circles. They got to be convoluted on the issue. It's just like rust on a car. The evolutionists hate this, but they hate it because it's simple, it's true, and it's a basic illustration that most people can understand. But you're going to have to be mostly not understandable if you want to try and deceive people into believing that they're related to banana plants because of deleterious mutation accumulation, selection, and gene flow, and epigenetics, and so on and so forth. Okay, none of those things are going to help take a bacteria-like organism into a whale over time. Way too much novelty and increasing and phenotypic complexity would have to occur. That's simply not observable. And so we see species hitting walls. We see variation and adaptation and speciation due to shifts in heterozygosity to homozygosity. That's a reduction in allelic variability. Okay, so we do see change, but the change is horizontal. It's not vertical. The change is simply not the kind of change that proponents of common descent and fish-to-fisherman evolution require. So it's time that the evolutionists tap out and convert to the biblical creation model, because it's biblical creationists that are making the best predictions, retrodictions on these issues. So Rusty Walker says, selection is a mechanism that keeps a species as strong reproductively fit. Yeah, exactly. Natural selection simply keeps a species as strong as it can be. That's it. It sees the big mutations. You know, you get a zebra in the wild. It's born with one leg that's a little shorter than the others. So you know what? Selection's probably going to remove that zebra from the equation, as it's not going to be able to run very fast, as it's got a defected leg. And so it's going to be first for dinner. So yeah, selection can see the big mutations, might be able to amplify your best beneficial mutation, but it's powerless to stop the low impact, the nearly neutral. See, why they're called nearly neutral is because they're neutral, which means they're neutral to selection. Selection can't see them. So they're going to build up over time, but they're nearly neutral because it turns out they're actually slightly deleterious, like rust on a car. Going back to this illustration that the evolutionists love so much, it's like rust on a car. Single rust molecules on their own, they're barely noticeable. They're inconsequential on their own, but over time they build up to the point where they're destructive. Just like a single spelling mistake in a book the size of an encyclopedia. On their own, these typographical errors, they are inconsequential, barely noticeable. But as they accumulate over time, sure, the book becomes more diverse, right? Because you're getting all these mistakes, these typographical errors, it's altering the text, but it's actually creating a muddled book. It's a confusing read. It's a degraded version of the original book before the original book had started to accumulate typographical errors. And so it's as simple as that, like single spelling mistakes in a book and rust on a car. These things build up, they degrade, they destroy. They're very harmful. So sure, that's all selection is. It's going to keep a species as strong as it can be, Rusty Walker. Let's see, as it can be within the niche that it currently occupies. Exactly. And so those environmental, that environmental niche that a specific animal is in is not going to help to solve this problem. Because again, those species are just going to be as strong as they can be as they accumulate generation after generation, more and more deleterious mutations. I wanted to go over a couple slides here. Most mutations are harmful, yet not harmful to be removed from the population by selection. That's genetic entropy in a nutshell. Okay. The vast majority of mutations are lost to drift, but some survive and increase in frequency within the population. So every single generation, as time goes on, they increase more and more, and that population therefore descends more and more into genetic sickness. Now, inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. And so we can actually get a sneak preview into genetic degeneration. You can look at it as microgenetic entropy. We see this in these inbred populations in the past, like Neanderthals, mammoths are a good example, Hobbit, right? Homo floresiensis. And so that's microgenetic entropy. View it as that. Macrogenetic entropy is what happens over time in large populations. Like in the human population right now, there are countless deleterious mutations. There's an increase in diseases and mutation-related diseases, to be specific. This becomes systematic once mutation fixation equilibrium is reached. And so I've written with a co-author a technical paper on mutation fixation equilibrium. Genetic drift in no way solves the mutational load paradox. Drift only makes the problem worse. So those that have tried to look to drift to save the day for evolution have failed. It means that many deleterious mutations will randomly drift to fixation, locking in harmful mutations. So according to the evolutionary model, you have thousands of years with the human populations in a small population. So right now, fixation is slower, right? Almost no mutations are becoming fixed because you got 8 billion people are spread out over the globe. But according to the evolutionary model, for thousands of years, you go back to the out of Africa scenario, you have the human population existing in a smaller populations and a high mutation rate, so mutations are entering the population, but the population's smaller. So mutations can drift to fixation quicker. Fixation just means to be stuck in place. That allele gets stuck in place at that genetic location, and every single individual in the population has it. Okay, so these mutations are slightly deleterious. They enter the population, the next generation. 100 new mutations per person per generation. They're subject to genetic drift because selection can't see them. And so over time, they drift to fixation. Now selection really can't do anything about the problem because that deleterious mutation is now fixed. It's stuck in place. Every single individual in the population has it. And so what that is irreversible and irreparable genetic damage. And so fixation equilibrium precludes evolutionary theory. It means humans did not evolve from ape-like ancestors. Fixation equilibrium to this day is a challenge. It's a problem that has not been sufficiently addressed. So here's right from the secular literature. Michael Lynch, Mutation in Human Exceptionalism, Our Future Genetic Load. On average, a newborn has 100 de novo mutations. So that's 100 new mutations per person per generation. Notice this, right from the conventional literature. In summary, the vast majority of mutations are deleterious. This is one of the most well-established principles of evolutionary genetics, supported by both molecular and quantitative genetic data, right from the conventional literature. Evolutionary scientists, population geneticists recognize there's a problem, or else they would not be putting forth rescue mechanisms like synergistic epistasis, like these various kinds of mutation count mechanisms, like super beneficial mutation accumulation, like genetic drift. If there really was no problem and we had no problem to be concerned about and engage, then you wouldn't have population geneticists proposing solutions. People aren't going to propose a solution for something that doesn't exist. So yes, the problem exists. Many in the evolutionary camp believe that these rescue mechanisms have saved the day, have answered this challenge, but in reality, they haven't. They haven't actually solved this challenge. And so the challenge is still there. The problem is there to be solved. The best that they've offered have simply failed. Notice this. Douglas Fatuma, Population Genetics textbook. Notice what he says. The great majority of these mutations that are fixed are effectively neutral with respect to fitness and are fixed by genetic drift. Fatuma says, since on average it will take 4 NE generations for such mutations to reach fixation, so in long-term evolutionary timescale, you have fixation equilibrium, which is a major challenge to the evolutionary model. Notice what he says. Basic population genetics. The same number of neutral mutations should be fixed. Now, the evolutionary community, these population geneticists, are going to assume that a lot of these mutations are absolutely neutral, when in fact, no, they're nearly neutral. So the problem's huge. It's massive, because now you got nearly neutral mutations becoming fixed every generation. The rate of fixation of mutations is theoretically constant. Notice this, and equals the neutral mutation rate. So if the neutral mutation rate is 50 mutations, that means the fixation rate's also 50 mutations, because over a long period of time, that's how many mutations are becoming fixed every generation, which means that is irreversible and irreparable damage every single generation. This is a huge problem for those that want to believe in evolution. Standard population genetics theory teaches that the rate of fixation of neutral mutations, which includes effectively neutral mutations, very slightly deleterious mutations, in a population equals the neutral mutation rate. Even with ongoing random loss due to genetic drift, classical population genetic theory states that over evolutionary timescales, a neutral mutation to fixation equilibrium point will be reached. When this occurs, the neutral mutation rate will equal the fixation rate. And that is one of the many major problems for those that want to believe in common descent, because the mutation rate is high. Most mutations are slightly deleterious and nearly neutral. And so that is a lot of damage occurring population-wide. When they're stuck in place, selection can't do anything about them, because that's it. They're fixed. So that's irreversible damage every single generation. For example, if the effectively neutral mutation rate is 50 per person per generation, then that means 50 nearly neutral being very slightly deleterious, guys. Mutations will become fixed every generation. That's amazing. Once those nucleotides become fixed, they can never be removed from the population due to genetic drift or purifying selection, except in the highly uncommon circumstance of a back mutation, which is so rare, it's almost like they don't happen. No way to counterbalance the damage. They have become, notice this, permanently established. This is damage that is now permanently established in that population, in the genome. The inevitable consequence of this process of fixation through genetic drift is the systematic decline in mean fitness. And yes, it occurs in very small increments. Every time a deleterious fixation event occurs. And this is why total functionality always goes down. It's a major challenge and problem that many in the evolutionary camp want to pretend that they've addressed. So Rusty Walker, I appreciate that comment.